Episode 40, Part 3, Chapter 37. Part 3. Chapter 37. Link should have counted himself as honored for being allowed to attend the meeting deep in the Great Hyrule Forest. The forest dwellers were a private folk, and the opportunity to visit them was very rare. Most of the knights in attendance left their attendants behind, save for only the most needed. His knight, however, Sir Russell of Kashudo, wished to bring his squire along, stating that it was only a matter of time before Link became a knight himself. It would be good for him to be seen by the king. Sir Russell also likely thought that it would be a good way to take Link's mind off all that had happened recently. No, Link thought, briefly squeezing his eyes shut. Don't think about that. His father wasn't there. That was a noticeable absence, considering that the king was present with his daughter, both riding near the front of the line. No, his father had been forced to take an extended leave of absence from his duties on the royal guard to deal with things back home. Stop. He forced himself to look up and around them as they rode through the dark forest. They had finally passed through the deepest portion of the forest, the place known as the Lost Woods for its mysterious way of causing travelers to lose their way. They likely wouldn't have ever made it through without their guide. Now, however, the canopy overhead lightened enough to allow thin shafts of light to pierce the gloom. The trees changed too, they were thick and verdant with taller trunks and branches far overhead. He could see movement in them: squirrels, birds, and possibly even some of the forest folk themselves. Link looked ahead. The line of horses was relatively small, and he, even near the rear of the line, could still see the royal family at the line's front. His eyes found the princess. She sat upright in a deep blue riding dress, her hair mostly hanging down, save for the braid that wrapped around her head like a crown. She was a couple years Link's junior, and he wasn't sure if he could start calling her pretty yet or not. She had the hints of future beauty, to be sure, but she was also only 15 and had much to grow. His eyes traveled over the royal family's attendants until he found the one he was looking for. One of Princess Zelda's mates, a few years older than Link. Now she was pretty. Attractive brown hair and eyes, a woman's figure, and a smile that captivated many a squire's heart. He wondered if he would have a chance to speak with her on this trip. He was certain that she had seen him at the tourney that spring. Link looked away from the woman, sighing. Even seeing the attractive woman could do little to improve his dire mood as of late. Maybe he should ask Sir Russell for more time away from the court, to go home and help his father or see how Errol was doing. The tree canopy overhead trembled, the leaves whispering softly, distracting Link from his thoughts. He glanced up, frowning, and finally spotted one of the forest folk, the first he had seen other than their diminutive guide. The forest folk, Koroks as they called themselves, were a race of fae-like beings. They appeared to be made entirely of wood, though their bodies were flexible like normal flesh. They had small arms and legs, and often stood no more than 1.5 feet tall, though some grew to twice that height. They always wore masks made of large leaves, usually pierced by their long noses. The Korok above Link giggled softly, making a soft sound like a rattle, and then it disappeared back up into the leafy canopy. He could see others peering down now as well, each seemingly just waiting to be seen before disappearing again. The leaves overhead shivered almost constantly now. They had arrived at the center of the Great Hyrule Forest. The column of Hylians rode into the large clearing at the forest's heart. There stood the largest tree that Link had ever seen. It was the largest tree in the world, as far as anyone knew. The Great Deku Tree, with a trunk as wide around as several of the homes in Castle Town and a canopy taller than any of the castle's towers, gazed down at them with a benevolent expression. It was also the only living tree that anyone knew about. Branches formed long eyebrows over a pair of strangely expression depressions in the wood that stood in for its eyes. It had a nose, formed from bark and beard and whiskers made from roots. It had a huge mouth as well, which opened as the royals approached.
"Greetings, King Roam," the Deku Tree said. "Welcome to my home. And greetings to you as well, Princess Zelda. You have grown in beauty since I last saw you."
As the king and princess exchanged pleasantries with the ancient tree spirit, Link and the others around him dismounted from their horses. Several of the older servants had begun speaking to some of the Koroks nearby to find out where they would be able to set up for the night. After such a long, arduous journey, Link would welcome the chance to rest, as he was sure the others would. He gently ran his palm along Epona's nose, smiling at his faithful horse, and fished an apple from his pack to offer her, which she gladly took. She was one of the few horses who had not acted skittish while traveling through the Lost Woods, a fact that he was quite proud of. After seeing to his horse, Link turned to see where some of the men and women were taking their things. He would be expected to carry Sir Russell's gear and set up his tent. As he did so, something caught his eye. He frowned, shifting slightly to be able to catch a glimpse of what he had seen. The princess and king stood on a slightly raised made from white stone. From his vantage, Link could see between the two royals, and he could just see a sword's blade glinting in the afternoon sunlight. The sword had been placed, point down, into a raised section of stone at the center of the dais. Link knew what the sword was, though he never actually knew for sure that it was even real. The sword that seals the darkness. The ancient blade of evil's bane. The master sword. It was the sword of legends from ages past, an old, powerful weapon that could only be pulled from the stone by a mythical hero. It was a sword spoken of by young squires around the meal tables, who imagined themselves pulling the sword and becoming powerful knights, saving the world, and falling in love with the princess. Foolish dreams of youth, Link knew, yet his heartbeat quickened at the sight of it. He had since given up such dreams, favoring reality now that he had grown into manhood, but to see the legendary blade itself. It brought up images in his head of drawing the sword and being praised for his valor. The princess shifted her weight and blocked the sword from view, breaking Link of the spell. He shook his head, exhaling slowly, and looked around for some direction. He saw that some of the other knights and attendants had started to remove saddlebags and equipment, and Link quickly followed suit, finding Sir Russell's horse and removing his gear. Link chose a suitable location for Sir Russell and erected the pair of small tents that he and his knight would sleep in that night. Though setting up the camp did not take very long, it was still getting late by the time everything was complete. Small oil lanterns were used to light the insides of the tents, but the forest clearing itself was lit by strange plants that hung from vines, giving off a soft, even glow. Koroks were all around them, though few came down from the trees to talk. Several of the men and women in their contingent seemed to be nervous around the forest folk, but Link didn't mind them. They had a habit of popping up in places and times one least expected to find them, admittedly, such as when venturing into the trees to relieve oneself, but their innocent demeanor made him smile. After finishing camp and eating a small meal with the few other squires in attendance, Link found himself released from his duties as Sir Russell turned in for the night. Many others went to sleep as well, and he knew that he should follow suit. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep for several hours, however. Sleep had been difficult to come by, as of late. So, instead, he chose to wander about some. He wasn't the only one still up, so he was not so out of place. He stuck to the paths around the Deku tree, not wishing to venture out so far as to end up back in the Lost Woods. The forest was beautiful at night. Dappled moonlight broke through the leaves, bathing everything around him in its pale light. The night was warm and pleasant, and the forest seemed alive with the sounds of nocturnal insects and animals. A number of fireflies appeared, adding their yellow-green light to that of the moon. He could even swear to have seen a small, colorful fairy with long, gossamer wings flitting about. It was peaceful. Link wished that he could feel the same way. He closed his eyes, but he could not so easily banish the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. His mother, lying in bed, skin pale and waxy, dark circles around her sunken eyes. Her voice, which had always been so beautiful and musical, hoarse and rasping. Her hands holding Link's in their weak grip. His mother, lying motionless and unseeing. His mother, shrouded in a burial cloth. The sudden pain threatened to overwhelm Link, and he reached out a hand to steady himself on a tree. His left hand clenched tightly into a fist as he tried to banish the tears that threatened to spill over. It had already been 3 months. Shouldn't he be past this by now? His father wasn't past it yet either. No, Link could still see the haunted look in his father's eyes as he spoke of his duty to their house. Arn didn't yet know what he would do for their land holdings in the Necluda region. Errol was, of course, still far too young to run the household, but Link's father also had an important role in the royal guard. In all likelihood, Arn would appoint someone to manage his holdings in the meantime, until he could find another suitable wife. A replacement.
Are you all right?
Said a soft, feminine voice behind him. Link stiffened, suddenly standing upright. He reached up quickly to wipe his wet eyes and turned. Princess Zelda stood directly behind him.
Your Highness,
he said, voice cracking. Shh. Princess Zelda waved her hands, shushing him. Link tried hard to compose himself, but his heart was racing. Of all the people to sneak up on him in the middle of the evening, Princess Zelda was the last one he expected or even wanted. After all, if he eventually became a knight in the royal guard, as he intended, he would likely have to guard her, as his father guarded the king. Would she even want such an emotional man in the guard?
Princess, I apologize. You startled me,
he said, lowering his voice. He glanced behind her, and at the notable lack of guards. He had wandered a fair distance away from the camp, around the backside of the Deku tree.
But what are you doing out here?
Princess Zelda rolled her eyes, the motion visible in the shaft of moonlight that illuminated her face. Link felt his face flush. Perhaps demanding to know what she was doing was the wrong thing to ask. He couldn't remember ever actually speaking to the princess before this. Should he bow?
I expect that I am out here for the same reason you are,
she said after a moment.
I could not sleep. Do you?
Link hesitated. He had no idea what to do in this situation. Should he tell someone that the princess was wandering around in the dark? Should he accompany her? The center of the forest was said to be safe, but Link had heard plenty of legends of the creatures that inhabited the Lost Woods.
Do you wish me to fetch one of your guards? I'm not sure how safe. I'm quite alright, thank you. This area is protected from monsters by the Deku tree's magic. It is safe. Yes, of course.
Link paused and took in the princess' appearance. He had first assumed that she was wearing a nightgown, but now that he looked at her more closely, he saw that she wore a flowing white dress with embroidery around the waist and sleeves. He had seen her wear it during their journey, usually in the evening and morning, before and after the day's ride, but never understood its significance. Princess Zelda looked at him for a time, considering. Finally, she asked, "What's your name?"
"Oh, I'm Link. Son of Arn, right?"
He nodded. The princess' expression softened.
"I am very sorry for your loss, then. I am familiar with the pain of losing one's mother."
Link's throat tightened at the princess' words. This was far from a conversation that he wished to have with the princess, of all people.
"I met her a few times,"
Princess Zelda said, thoughtfully.
"In the court and once when visiting your lands in the east. She always seemed to be a very strong, capable woman. A good match for your father."
"Yes," Link said, haltingly. Princess Zelda looked back at him. In the moonlight, she didn't look as young as she was. The dress and the expression on her face made her look older.
"You are the squire to Sir Russell, are you not?"
she asked, after a moment of silence. Link nodded, not quite trusting his voice yet.
"Then perhaps you would be willing to accompany me on my walk? I have heard talk of your skill with the sword. Surely there would be no problem with my being out with a capable squire by my side."
Link felt immediately bolstered by the comment. He was already well known for his skill among the knights, but for the princess to have heard. But would the royal guard find his presence to be acceptable? He met Princess Zelda's eyes, and he saw a slight spark of defiance there. She would not wait here for him to fetch someone, if he refused.
"Yes, your highness,"
he said.
"Good."
She began walking around the base of the Deku tree, and Link dutifully followed. They walked together in silence for a time. The princess appeared to be content in looking at the trees and foliage, occasionally crouching down to run her fingers along a leaf or flower. She seemed to be studying the fauna. He watched as she plucked a leaf from a tree, turning it over in her hand curiously. After a few moments, she glanced at him and looked slightly surprised, as if she had forgotten that he was even there.
"Did you know that this wasn't the original location of the Great Hyrule Forest?"
she asked, turning back to inspect her leaf.
"No, I've never heard that,"
Link said.
"Ancient texts and maps place the Deku tree and the forest far to the south, near the Great Plateau. But no one knows how or why it moved. Why not ask the Deku tree?"
She looked back up at him, cocking one eyebrow.
"Well, it's not the same Deku tree." "Oh. The Deku tree has an extremely long life, of course, but even it has not been alive for so long. Every few thousand years or so, the Deku tree apparently plants a seedling that will eventually grow into a new Deku tree in the place of the old one, which passes away shortly thereafter." I had never heard that. "That isn't surprising. It is a more scholarly matter than anything. The Deku tree does appear to retain at least some memories from its previous generations, but it rarely speaks of them. As far as I know, it has never spoken of the previous location of the forest. Perhaps it doesn't even remember."
Princess Zelda let the leaf fall as she looked up the large, imposing trunk of the Deku tree.
In all likelihood, the old location of the forest became untenable for some reason, so the Deku tree at that time sent its seedling to this location, where a new forest grew up around it. There are other theories, though.
Link had no idea why the princess was even talking to him about this, but she seemed excited for some reason. He, however, could not particularly share in her excitement. It was little more than a forest to him.
I think the most interesting thing is the Lost Woods,
Princess Zelda said, looking back at Link.
I understand how the Deku tree could have moved, but ancient lore speaks of the Lost Woods as well. If the new forest grew around the Deku tree, then that suggests that the Lost Woods are directly tied to its power. The Deku tree somehow creates the Lost Woods, but why? For protection,
he said.
Most likely. The Deku tree's bark is quite valuable. But if that were the case, why not plant the Deku tree somewhere hidden or harder to reach? Why create a magical forest to keep people out and then make guides to help people through it? I'm not sure.
She glanced at him again, and he thought he saw a flash of disappointment in her eyes. Had he said the wrong thing? After a moment, she turned and began to walk again. He quickly followed. The silence stretched for a long moment before Link spoke again.
Maybe the Lost Woods are a kind of trial.
She looked over her shoulder at him.
What makes you think that?
Link thought of the Master Sword, sitting in its pedestal at the center of the forest.
Well, the Lost Woods wouldn't be that protective, ultimately. Even if they are difficult to navigate, they could be burned down easily enough by attackers. But someone on a special quest could be required to pass through the woods to reach the heart of the forest.
Princess Zelda nodded thoughtfully.
That is a popular theory among scholars. The Lost Woods is often thought to be a trial for those seeking wisdom or knowledge from the Deku tree. And then there is the Master Sword, of course.
Link's heart sank slightly. Of course, scholars had already discussed such things at length. Did he really think that his idea would have been original in any way?
Another popular theory on the origins of this forest is that the entire forest somehow actually moved from the south. That it isn't a new forest, in relative terms, but that it physically relocated somehow. How would it do that?
Link asked.
I am truly not certain. But ancient technology and magic were able to accomplish incredible feats in the past. It is certainly another possibility. That's why I have been studying the fauna. I was curious if I would find any evidence of plants from the south.
Wouldn't someone else have already discovered that by now? Link thought, though he kept such things to himself.
Did you find anything? No. While there are plants native to either North and South Hyrule, our country is not so large as to have too many major differences in its ecology. At least not in its heartland, where the climate is largely similar between the North and South. The same cannot be said for the surrounding regions, of course, such as the Farron Rainforest or the Hebra Mountains.
Princess Zelda paused by the stone dais. They had already made their way around the Deku tree to its front again. Link could see the Master Sword glinting in a shaft of moonlight that shone down on it from above. The princess looked at the sword thoughtfully.
Princess. You are out late this evening.
She gasped and looked up at the deep voice. Link did the same, gazing up at the large face belonging to the Deku tree. It smiled at them.
Oh, Deku tree, I apologize if we disturbed your slumber,
Princess Zelda said.
It is quite all right. And who is this with you?
The Deku tree gazed down at Link, and its smile grew.
Yes. The man named Link.
Link froze, confused. Why did the Deku tree know his name? Did someone tell the tree about him? Princess Zelda looked as confused as he felt, looking over at Link with a curious expression.
Do not look so surprised,
the Deku tree said.
I take the time to learn about everyone who steps into my realm. And what do you think, young Link? This is your first time visiting my forest.
Link hesitantly stepped up onto the dais, feeling embarrassed.
It's quite beautiful, Deku tree. I am sure that a moonlit stroll with a beautiful young woman is nice as well.
Link felt his face grow warm, and he spared a glance towards the princess, who had adopted a very controlled expression. He thought that her cheeks seemed redder, though.
Tell me, you two, what do you know of the sword that sits there?
Link glanced down towards the sword. The Master Sword had a magnificently crafted purple hilt, with green wrapping around the grip. The crossguard was shaped like a pair of outstretched wings, upturned towards the blade. The blade, itself, was without blemish. Link could see some ancient markings on it, including the 3 triangles found in the royal sigil. It was a beautiful blade. For a moment, Link's thoughts took him back to just a few years prior, when he and the other squires boasted about the legendary sword that none of them had even seen. What would they say if they knew he was here, looking down at the Master Sword, Princess Zelda by his side? It seemed like a scene lifted right out of their boastful fantasies.
It is the Master Sword, Princess Zelda said. The blade wielded by the ancient hero in battle against the Calamity Ganon.
Calamity Ganon? Link thought, tearing his eyes away from the Master Sword. He had never heard the phrase before. Something about it felt familiar to him, though. As if he had heard it once in a dream.
Yes, indeed,
the Deku Tree said.
It is an ancient blade, created by the goddess Hylia before Hyrule was even a nation. Created to face her ancient foe, Demise.
Princess Zelda nodded slowly, taking a small step forward.
It has been used many times throughout history, always by a chosen hero who is called in times of great need. Yes, and only the chosen hero can answer its call. Though many others have tried to pull it free of the stone, none have been able to for 10,000 years.
10,000 years. Link shifted uncomfortably as the Deku Tree and Princess spoke, eyes traveling back to the Master Sword. It was a beautiful blade. He stepped closer to the blade, looking down at it curiously. Why did this feel so familiar? Why was he so drawn to the sword? Link slowly reached out, touching the sword's pommel with a tentative finger. Hello, Master. He gasped, pulling his hand back. The voice in his head it had spoken so clearly. So audibly. Had anyone else heard it? He looked at the princess, but she was still speaking with the Deku Tree. He couldn't hear what they were saying anymore, though not with that voice still whispering in the back of his mind.
Did you hear that?
Zelda looked back at him, frowning. But then the Deku Tree said something, and she looked back at it, Link apparently forgotten. He looked back at the sword and licked his lips. Had he imagined it? He hesitantly reached out again, wrapping the fingers of his left hand around the grip. He heard no voices, but when his skin came in contact with it, he felt something stir within him. Something called him. It urged him on. To try. He had seen several of the knights do so, after all. It appeared to be something of a tradition, even, perhaps, a competition, among them, as well as an enjoyable show for the Koroks, who encouraged them. He placed both hands on the sword's grip, shifting so that his feet were planted slightly more than shoulder width apart. And then, without fully understanding why, he pulled. He hadn't participated in the game earlier. As a squire, he hadn't wanted to inject himself into the activity that was clearly a tradition among the knights. But none of them had been able to pull the sword free of the stone. The sword hadn't even budged, no matter how hard they pulled, and several of the knights appeared to have been wearied by the experience. It did not exhaust Link. He did not strain, grunting and face turning red. He didn't flex, making a show of his efforts. He just pulled. And the Master Sword slid smoothly from the stone. The conversation between Princess Zelda and the Deku Tree stopped as the metal rang out. The princess turned to look at Link, a look of shock on her face. Her lips formed words, but nothing came out. Link stared down at the sword, its pointed tip hovering just a few inches above the empty slot in the ground. He had pulled the sword free. He had pulled the Master's sword free. How was that possible? It shouldn't have come free. Link watched a dozen men try to pull it free that day, and not one of them had been able to do so. Why did it do so for him? Why him?
Ah!
The Deku Tree smiled benevolently as he gazed down towards Link.
Yes, I thought you might be the one. The child of destiny.
Princess Zelda, looking suddenly little more than a child, gazed between Link and the Deku Tree, eyes wide.
Do you mean? Yes, my dear.
The tree's voice grew grave. A breeze blew through the leaves of the forest, adding their hushed whispers to the moment.
The time has come for the hero to rise again. No,
she whispered. Link slowly raised the sword, marveling at the way it felt in his hand. The breeze grew stronger, swirling around him. He had drawn the Master Sword. The first in 10,000 years. The Deku Tree had called him the child of destiny. He had done so with the princess by his side just like in his fantasies of old. He looked at her. And he saw Princess Zelda's expression, really saw it. Her horror. The fantasy popped like a bubble in his mind. And he suddenly knew that this was not a day that would be celebrated. Not by her. And not by others who knew the truth. The time had come for the hero to rise again. Link sat by his small fire, which he had lit underneath a small rock overhang. It did little to shield him from view, but that was less important now. He was pretty sure that he had left the Guardian's search radius by now. He hadn't seen one of the mechanical beasts for days. Around him were his meager possessions. The shield that he recovered from the castle, his Zora sword, a crude wooden bow and arrows that he managed to steal out of a bokoblin encampment while they slept. He didn't have his ancient sword any longer, it had broken in the castle, nor the Sheikah slate. It was the Sheikah slate that hurt the most to lose. It had been one of his best modes of transportation, after all, and an incredibly useful tool in his travels. Without it, he had no way of letting his friends know that he survived his trip into the castle. They likely still had no idea what happened to him, or even where he had gone. But Link regretted its loss for more than its utility. It held memories as well. Hundreds of photographs taken by Princess Zelda, on their travels together 100 years in the past. He had stopped paying as much attention to those in the recent weeks, prior to his defeat at Hyrule Castle, largely because of his growing resentment towards the princess. Now, however, he missed it terribly. He had been such a fool. The castle was miles away now, hidden by trees and the rising and falling of the hills around him, but he could still place exactly where it should be on the horizon. He hadn't seen Calamity Ganon rising today, which was a hopeful sign. The monster appeared, flying around the castle's towers, far more often than it did when Link first woke. Zelda still appeared to be in control, however, always appearing in the form of a beacon of light that pulled the creature back down into its prison. "She's so strong," he told himself as he poked at his fire. He was in awe. She was far more than he had even realized from his limited memories. He could tell that Ganon grew stronger, though. The earth trembled often, and Link saw evidence of new eruptions on Death Mountain when he crossed the ridge north of Hyrule Castle. There were also the Guardians, which seemed far more active now, patrolling back and forth. Looking for him. The time that followed his defeat at the castle had been harrowing. The Guardians searched for him relentlessly, never growing tired or complacent. Link, without a weapon with which to face them effectively, had been forced to hide and flee, sticking to the trees that dotted the ridge north of the castle, where he eventually washed up on shore. Thoughts of his last moments in the castle brought back painful memories, and Link reached up, absently touching the place where the Guardian shot him. The skin there had healed after a few days, Mipha's influence, no doubt, but the flesh remained scarred. A new scar to match the identical one on his back, which he assumed he sustained in his fight against the Guardians 100 years prior. His champion's tunic, of course, was ruined, and Link was forced to rid himself of it. Its color still stood out, despite the burns and blood stains. Only within the last couple of days did he finally replace the tunic with one tunic that may have once been another color, though it was more of a muted gray now. He had found it in the remains of an old military training camp along the edge of the ridge. He had been forced to kill several Lizalfos that had taken up residence in the camp. The progress following his defeat had been slow. Zelda told him where to find the Master Sword, a weapon that he now understood to be of utmost importance, and so he decided to make his way north to the Great Forest, which he could see from atop the ridge. Getting there, however, was more difficult than he hoped it would be. The forest was on an island surrounded by several miles of water. At the time, Link hadn't even been able to see a way to cross onto the forested island, which itself stretched for miles and miles. He almost started traveling north, but ultimately chose to travel east, thinking that he could remember seeing a road in that direction on his Sheikah slate. After a few days of slow travel, being forced to evade detection from the Guardians, he eventually saw the land bridge that connected the forest to the surrounding region. It took him 2 weeks to finally reach his location now, just outside of the Great Hyrule Forest's entrance. 2 weeks to cross a distance that, by his estimation, was close to the same distance he and Cass crossed when going through Hyrule Field. And during the entire trip, he had feared that Calamity Ganon could break free at any moment and lay waste to the land. Food and water had been scarce early on during his trek. The forest moat was at the bottom of a deep basin, too steep for Link to safely climb down, and he didn't dare approach the castle's moat. Instead, he subsisted off of rainwater, plants, and berries for the first week, until he finally came across the bokoblin camp and stole the bow. He could have killed the monsters but chose not to. The guardians were still close at that time, and he feared the noise would attract them. All of his travels led to this, however. He looked down at the enormous forest and knew what he would find at its center. And now, he could remember finding it before the Master Sword. Seeing the forest brought the memory of that fateful day flooding back into him. The confusion, excitement, and fear. The painful loss of his mother, whose name he still didn't know. The vague knowledge of his sister, Errol. And Zelda. So young, yet already burdened with the fate of the world. The Master Sword sealed her fate just as much as it sealed his. That was why she looked so scared. He only partially understood it at the time, not having yet seen her pain, frustration, and perseverance. The sword joined them together in a way that neither of them had known. To think that he once thought that he would one day join the Royal Guard. He had been right, in a way. Link closed his eyes, calling to mind his newfound memories of that night. The surprising peace he felt when walking beside her. Her detailed analysis of everything around her. Everything was a matter of study. He saw only a tree, but she saw history. It was nearly enough to send him charging into the castle again. But no. That had been a foolish mistake that nearly cost them everything. In fact, it still very well could. There was no telling how much longer Zelda could keep Ganon imprisoned. If he broke free before they were ready, then everything could be lost. He opened his eyes again, looking down at the darkening forest. Tomorrow. He would enter it and begin his trek through. He had vague recollections of the first journey he made, the place of shadow that he would first have to pass through. The trial, as he put it in his memory. He would find his way to the forest's heart, however. He would retrieve the Master Sword. For the time had come for the hero to rise again. End of chapter.